1993. This is 21 years later, and the reason I start with this is that our efforts to obtain an oral history on audio videotape for the North American chapter of the International Society for Cardiovascular Surgery includes going back to the past presidents and asking them if they could review their thoughts during the time that they were president and share any things with us from that year. Professor Charles G. Robb is with us today. Charles, what we're asking you to do is to look back to Carmel, California, 21 years ago when you were president of the North American chapter of the International Society for Cardiovascular Surgery, at that time called International Cardiovascular Society. But could you please recall your time as president, 1971, 1972, for us?
I'll do my best. Well, as you know, you were elected president the year before, in 1971, and that was in Philadelphia. And the past presidents, presumably who elected me, were Morrow, Jack Wiley, and Jack Cannon. And the great thing about the meeting in Carmel, to my mind, was it was the last meeting in a medium to small-sized resort town. After that, we met in much larger cities, and now we have to meet in very large cities because things got too big. Or I wouldn't say too big, but it's got a lot bigger. And Carmel, we had a pleasant convention hall, which was not large. We were all in one hotel, or a few may have been elsewhere. And it was a very nice, pleasant, small town to meet. And I think we all had a good time.
Well, I would certainly echo that. Those of us who had the privilege of being there with you recall that as being a very, very enjoyable meeting all the way around. I particularly remember your presidential address in that auditorium in Carmel, and I remember that you emphasized that there were two important contributions to date in vascular surgery. Would you care to comment on your presidential address for us?
Well, I reviewed the history of arterial surgery, and in my opinion, we've only been, even today, two truly original ideas into arterial surgery. The other ideas have come from other branches of surgery. And the two basic original ideas, which changed surgery to quite a bit, were the introduction by Tom Fogarty of the Fogarty catheter. That, as we all know, is a balloon which was passed through the thrombus or embolus, usually an embolus, and then inflated and withdrawn, hopefully with the embolus. And that was a major advance, but an even bigger one was the introduction by Arthur Voorhees of Columbia Presbyterian Hospital of plastic porous cloth, which was not a complete tube, but formed a tube made of the plastic mesh and the blood clots in the small holes. And this was a huge advance. I believe it changed vascular surgery more than almost anything else, because before that we were dependent on homografts or veins, and veins would. You had many patients in which there was not a homograft suitable, you couldn't get one, and the veins were not available, and this made arterial surgery, particularly of the large and medium-sized vessels, was now possible, even when there was no efficient substitute.
Well, we appreciate that very much. Others would point out that your own contribution, along with Mr. Eastcott and Pickering at St. Mary's with carotid surgery, certainly was a milestone in vascular surgery. And I know you've made an emphasis for other reasons about developing techniques that are useful instruments that would help with the techniques, but we appreciate those words very much. Also, you were made president because of your many contributions in many areas, and we don't have the opportunity today to go through those, but your own interest in vascular surgery back to World War II and your experience at the time you were in the British Medical Corps were certainly very important. Do you recall any of the politics at that time when you were president? I say politics, relationship with the Society for Vascular Surgery. Was there a joint council at that time?
Well, there wasn't really a joint council. We had a small council. I think it was the early stages of the joint council. The president of the other society attended the meeting, but it wasn't a full joint council. I think we had, John Foster was still the secretary. He had been the secretary for many years. He was a very good secretary, there's no question about that. We all know he had a problem later on, but in that year he was still mentally excellent, and he did a good job. That was a fact. The other thing I think is important to discuss that occurred at that time was a decision was made, and I frankly can't remember who was there, but certainly it was Morrow, myself, Foster, Cannon, and Jack Wiley were there, and we decided essentially to open the membership of the International Cardiovascular Society North American chapter to a wide bunch of surgeons, and that the Society of Vascular Surgery would be the more elite, smaller group. Probably the best comparison would be to compare the International Cardiovascular Society to a role like the American College of Surgeons, and that the Society of Vascular Surgery would have a role like the American Surgical Association. In other words, a more limited membership situation. And that decision was certainly made at Carmel. And I think the real disadvantage of that on the long haul was, as a result, the meetings became so large because we opened up the International Society to a very large number of people, and it became so large that we no longer could meet in a nice place like Carmel.
Yes. Well, we know some of the subsequent history. Of course, what you decided is certainly what has happened, and there have been some subsequent discussions between the two societies, but at this moment, and particularly because of our exchanges in 1990, the Joint Council is very strong and now functioning most appropriately for all of us. Back to Carmel for a minute. Do you remember how we were greeted by Bill and Marilyn Blaisdell, who were sort of the local arrangements committee, with a glass of champagne as we entered the hotel?
I certainly do. They did a beautiful job. They were very good hosts, and of course Ron Stoney was there, who organized a party too. It is somewhere in the country. I couldn't go to that for personal reasons. But Bill Blaisdell and his wife really did a good job. And he was then, I think, still in San Francisco.
Yes.
He hadn't moved down to his present position.
Well, we're sorry you missed the afternoon at Ron Stoney's ranch. Fortunately, in the archives, we do have a number of photographs. Many people did go, and we'll be able to look back at those photographs with a lot of fond memories.
Yeah, the whole meeting, the social side of that meeting went very well.
Well, and in subsequent years, when the decision to separate the Society for Vascular Surgery from the ISCVS was being contemplated, everybody referred back to your year as president at Carmel, so we all remember that very well. Is there anything else that you would like to mention about that period of time? And I ask that because what I would like to do, if not, is to go back recognizing that you were president of the International Cardiovascular Society's World Organization 13 or 14 years before you were president of the North American chapter.
Well, there's one other thing about the Carmel meeting, I think. It was a meeting where we still did not have a group of professional organizers. We now have the group in Manchester, New Hampshire, who, I think it's New Hampshire, anyway, the group there who organize our meetings, and they do a very good job. But there's some advantages to having a smaller group and doing it ourselves, and it costs a lot less, I can tell you. And I think we now can afford it because of the large income from the journal. But we did all, that was the last, or not the last, but decisions were made then to go ahead into the future and approach some professional organization to take over the administration of the meeting.
I can't recall entirely, but I don't think there were any exhibits in Carmel, were there? There weren't any exhibitors?
No, there weren't.
Yeah, I didn't think so.
No, there weren't.
Yeah.
And we didn't have, in those days, we didn't have industrial sponsorship. We really paid for it ourselves.
Yes. Going back, one of the things that our good friend Harry Shoemaker and I discussed yesterday was that the original name for this specific organization was the International Society of Angiology, and that name was changed after the first few years to the International Cardiovascular Society. And we're talking about the origins back to the early 1950s, and our North American chapter meetings have been held every year since 1952. But since you were involved in the very beginning and were one of the first, you were one of the very early presidents of the overall group, could you reflect a little bit on some of the origins of our society?
Well, I was president. I was elected president in Munich, Germany, and that's of the overall group. And the actual meeting I was president at was in Dublin, Ireland. And I think it was a 2-year gap between being elected and the meeting. At that time, the move away from the Society of Angiology was occurring, and also the cardiac surgeons were becoming more part of our group. And that was why angiology didn't cover the title fully. I think the early days, as though it was a small group, we had very strong representation from certain European countries, particularly France, Portugal, the Scandinavian countries, and Britain. But we also had people, although the communist world was very separate, they sent people to the meetings, and we had quite a bunch of fellows from Hungary and the Soviet Union.
Were you at that very first meeting in 1953 in Lisbon by any chance?
No, I couldn't get to that meeting, but I know all about it, and I was sort of...
Dr. Jaime Vici is going to review that 40 years later in Lisbon at the 1993 ISCVS World Meeting, as we know, World Congress, so we'll hear more about it.
He was certainly there. You see, there were certain people who were very strong in the early days. Henry Jaime Vici was one. Ralph Detteling was another. He was a strong... Harry Shoemaker himself was a strong leader at that time. And it was a problem of becoming more surgical and less medical, because the angiologists were not surgeons, many of them, and we did have a lot of members who were not surgeons, but the surgeons gradually became the dominant force in those days. They were strong meetings, and I think one forgets this large, a great number of people who supported the society from countries which you don't think of today, like Portugal, Spain, Italy, particularly those three. We had a number from Germany, but they weren't in Switzerland, but the Portuguese, particularly with Santos, Sousa Pereira and others, were very strong leaders. And we did have the man who won the Nobel Prize, who was from Portugal, he won it for prefrontal leucotomy, but his real contribution was, in my opinion, he was the first man to do a carotid arteriogram.
Was that Moniz?
Yes, Moniz.
Moniz, yes.
He won the Nobel Prize for the introduction of a surgical operation, which isn't any good. So that was a strange mistake, but he won. In fact, he's the only man, I think, who won a Nobel Prize for introducing a surgical procedure.
Considering that you were chief of surgery at St. Mary's in London when this organization was founded, do you remember how you were first contacted, or who first?
Yes, I do. I think John Kinmoth, who was in, he'd been with me at St. Thomas's, and he went back. At this time he was at St. Bartholomew's Hospital in London, and he was one of the early pioneers, and several of the senior men in England at that time who were not in the modern era of vascular surgery. I mean, people like Learmonth and Patterson Ross were in the society, and they were supportive of it.
Yes. Again, thinking back to that period of time, did you have the organization of a European chapter of the organization going on at the same time that you were involved in the...
Yes, we did. We had a European chapter, and that was a successful chapter. And there was a North American chapter, a European chapter, a Latin American chapter, I think. While I was president, we formed a Far East chapter, and I think subsequently there's been an Australasian chapter and one in the Middle East too.
Yes, yes. That was Dublin, 1959, was that about?
1961.
1961.
Yes.
In
That
Dublin.
was a very good meeting. The Irish were good hosts, very good, and it was well attended, and it was a combined meeting of the Society of Vascular Surgery and the International Society of Surgery, which I think was a good thing. If they subsequently split off for reasons unknown to me. But Dahl Iversen was the president, he's from Copenhagen, Denmark, was the president of the International Society of Surgery, and that was run out of Belgium at that time. And they had a very strong central organization. Is now the secretary's last few years has been in Switzerland.
Yes.
Iversen was a good surgeon, nice gentleman.
Well, many of us have lamented the falling out, if you will, between the International Surgical Society, or the Société Internationale des Chirurgies, and our own ISCVS. And of course, many of us have been members of both groups for a long time. And what is sad in this day of demands and less resource is the fact that this year, as an example, the International Surgical is in Hong Kong, and 3 weeks later the International Cardiovascular is in Lisbon. And one of the real ironies is that the International Surgical Society will go to Lisbon in 2 years. Do you have any recollections? Were there certain personalities involved in this differing opinion?
Well, yes, there were. I think what basically happened was, my recollection is that the International Surgical Society was run very much out of Belgium. And certain people, some in this country, like Everett Graham, sort of felt that the money, what perhaps was being, well, let's face it, I think they thought that some of the people in Belgium were traveling first class all the time, and that the money was going into that kind of activity. And I think he tried to reduce the power of the central office, which was in Belgium, and I think he failed. And several other people were in that thing, and from not only from this country, from several countries, and their failure, I think, was quite disruptive. And the vascular group were not connected with that, but the International Society decided, I think, of surgery, decided that they would go their own way and not meet with anybody else. But we did meet as an international group subsequently in Rome, and I think in Stockholm, and then after, perhaps about 1970, they started to go their own ways.
Well, interestingly enough, I recall one of the first combined meetings that I was able to attend, because I was not allowed to go to Moscow at the last moment in the early 1970s, but I did go to Barcelona in 1973, and I think we all recall that joint meeting as a very good meeting.
That's right.
2 years later in Edinburgh in 1975, I think it was a fairly good meeting. I didn't get to Tokyo, Kyoto in 1977. I don't know whether you went to that one in Japan or not.
Yes, I did. I went to that. I gave a Matas lecture at that, and that was a nice meeting.
Well,
that was combined.
Yeah, and 2 years later in San Francisco in 1979, and that's when Martin Allgauer had first taken over the International Surgical and was making efforts to try to keep the two together. But in the 80s, it really did fall apart, and I don't know why either for sure, except that both organizations became larger, and there are so many people involved that it just became easier to have separate meetings, I guess.
I think so, and I think there were other specialty groups, like the thoracic surgeons and people like, and many colorectal surgeons who kind of wanted their own meetings, and it split apart.
Speaking of that, and recalling that you were involved first in the European chapter, there have been more cardiothoracic surgeons in the European chapter than in the other chapters, probably, and that probably remains true today. Do you have any thoughts about how it's been conducted in the past and what the future might be between cardiothoracic and or vascular or general vascular?
Well, cardiovascular, until the introduction of an efficient pump oxygenator, which caused cardiac surgery to expand rapidly, they were fairly well blended. I mean, people did closed mitrals and closed cardiac procedures, and they weren't too different from vascular. And I myself would always do, I always did the coarctations and things like that. And then gradually, with the efficient cardiopulmonary bypass, and that really came in and took off in the early 60s, it swept cardiac surgery into a major position, and I think they wanted to have their own show. But some people did, and there's no doubt about it, cardiothoracic became the dominant cardiac forum in North America, whilst in Europe the International Cardiovascular Society continued to represent cardiac and vascular surgeons.
Since in Europe, about 7 years ago now, they created yet another new society, the European Society for Vascular Surgery, because so many of the general vascular surgeons did not want to be associated with the cardiovascular surgeons anymore. Do you have any thoughts about this? Do you think there's any possibility that we can get people together again, or should we not even try?
Well, I think there's no reason why the European Society for Vascular Surgery shouldn't actually merge with the chapter, the European chapter. I can see no reason why that shouldn't happen. But they've got to listen to a few cardiac papers, and I think that's what they don't want to do.
Sam Mellick, following you, is the current president of the world body of ISCVS, as we know. And he was in Athens last September with an olive branch to the European Society for Vascular Surgery, asking them to at least meet with the European chapter of ISCVS, and they're willing to do that. They envision in some ways having a SVS, ISCVS joint council like we have in North America, and there may be some merit to that initially. But I think one of the things that's happened probably in Europe as well as in our region is that the cardiovascular people have organized so many of their own meetings that they'd rather go listen to only heart papers and not have to listen to the peripheral vascular surgery too.
Right.
So that continues to be a challenge.
Keep the cardiac people out of it. There's no reason why the vascular group shouldn't merge.
But since you and I attended the 41st annual meeting of the North American chapter of ISCVS here in Washington just a couple of weeks ago, there still is some participation in this part of the world of both. And yet you'll know the one breakfast meeting that was canceled was the one on cardiac papers, because there were only 10 people who signed up. So I think in our part of the world the writing's on the wall, and that when some of the more senior people like Dr. DeBakey and Dr. DeWeese and others who have done both are gone, the newer generation probably won't have that same interest.
No, I don't think they will, and I think the cardiacs will merge with the thoracic. It'll be cardiothoracic, and the vascular will be the vascular group.
Do you recall anything about the economics of the world body of the International Cardiovascular Society when you were president? Were there big problems with economics?
No, we had the dues were paid, and it was fine. There weren't exhibitors or a major feature. There was a journal which was published in Italy, and it didn't lose money, but it didn't seem to pay over money. I have no idea what happened to the money, because we know about the huge amount of money which is made by the Journal of Vascular Surgery, and the other one, I've got a feeling the publishers pocketed the cash.
Well, you know, speaking of that, and of course we all know of that journal as the Green Journal. It was a journal of cardiovascular surgery. Can you recall anything about the origins of that journal and what the discussions were when you were president for the World Group?
Yes, I certainly can. The The Green Journal, in the years just after World War II, published papers in many languages. And it was a very difficult journal to read. And we had a meeting in, I think it was in Dublin, and I was certainly present, in which it was just a proposal was made by the Europeans to publish in one language. And then the decision was which language. And there was a very strong plea put forward by Fontaine and Arnault and others from France to have French as the language. And I felt, sitting there quietly and not saying much, that it was going to be the choice of the thing. And then suddenly Dos Santos spoke up, and he had a Cid Dos Santos from Portugal, who, by the way, would have spoke every known language. And he said, look, in today, in science, French is not an important language. It's been the language of culture and pleasure to everybody in Europe, but we've got to think to the future. And we are a scientific body, and it should be English. And you know, that swung the meeting over. So I really didn't say much, but we came out that English was the language. The French people didn't shoot me because I didn't say anything.
Well, that's very good. And
it was
Professor Dos Santos,
swung it over.
Knowing that the Italians have always been a strong part of this organization, and that the journal was in Milan,
That's right.
and Eduardo Milan was the first publisher of the revised Green Journal and so forth, was there any efforts to have it published in Italian, or did they?
No, they didn't want that. They voted for English.
Well, and you know,
I think it was the sales too.
Yeah.
You see, by then, English was the language. Was the language of science.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter whether you were Russian, German, Scandinavian, and by the way, a huge bloc, Scandinavia, had made English the official language of their universities, because there weren't enough people speaking Norwegian to really allow it to be the official language.
Yeah.
And that made a big swing, because you had the whole of Scandinavia, Britain, and a lot of other countries did speak a lot of English, particularly in their universities.
Well, recognizing that German was certainly the scientific language at the turn of the century, I would imagine that the two negative World War situations probably kept that from even being part of the discussion.
Well, German, there's no question about it, the German contributors to science of all kinds, particularly up to the beginning of World War I, where they led the world, there's no question about it. But after that, there was I think their literature, gradually they lost out, and English became the language of countries like Italy, Scandinavia, and Eastern Europe. Even English was spoken a great deal. The Russians spoke excellent German, many of them, because they'd been so close before World War II. But by the end of World War II, they just didn't want to speak it anymore.
Did you know Professor Milan?
Yes, I did. Eduardo was a nice gentleman. He was a fine man. He was an expert on congenital arteriovenous malformations.
Yes.
And I think he received patients all over the world with those. And I knew him well. Yes, he was a fine man.
When you were still at St. Mary's, did you receive your copies of the Journal of Cardiovascular Surgery on time? Was that?
No, that never kept, to my experience, it was always late and slow, but it wasn't a bad journal.
Well, probably the same when you got to Rochester. You probably found the same.
I don't think the mail, it was nothing to do with the mail system.
Well, you know, appreciating that you were certainly one of the prime factors in my getting started in the North American chapter of the International Society for Cardiovascular Surgery, because thinking back, you were the chairman of the nominating committee when I was made the treasurer of that august group. And you may or may not remember, I took over from Jack Conley, and I was somewhat shocked to find out that the budget was in the deficit over $2,000. And
right. Well, we needed a good man to straighten it out.
Well, it was something that I share with you, because I also remember while I was struggling, and you and several others said, well, Norman, you need to raise the dues. And when I made that suggestion to raise the dues, at the next business meeting, Stan Crawford was the treasurer of the Society for Vascular Surgery, and he recommended that the dues be dropped $10. And remember, from $50 to $40. And my heart sank, because all I could think is, I'm finished. Nobody will let me be in office. But as you'll also remember, I had to stay in office for 6 years until I could make sure I had the budget straightened out and get it back in the black.
Well, we didn't have in those days the large financial contributions we have today, particularly from the exhibitors and from the journal. And now, you know, you probably could reduce the dues now, but then we've got all these extra responsibilities, like the Lifeline Foundation and so on.
One of the other things I'll share with you, because I've never told you this before, I'm sure. When I went back and looked at the mailing list from the Journal of Cardiovascular Surgery that came from Milan, I began to recognize that they were still sending the journals to some people who had left this earth. And as I began to go through the numbers and find out that there were people who had retired and weren't paying dues anymore on that list, actually I came up with 104 subscriptions that we were able to cancel because we were paying for all of those that weren't going anywhere.
Okay.
And that was part of the problem,
well, I
too.
don't think the group in Milan was an efficient group. The journal, that particular Excerpta Medica, they had a whole lot of journals. I mean, all sorts of journals in all sorts of subjects. And Milan did our one, and it was very much in the city of Milan. It was a major activity, and I think they didn't really know much what was going on.
Well, as you know, some 39 to 40 years later, the journal is now a new journal called Cardiovascular Surgery, published by a British publishing company, Butterworth. Kevin Bernan from St. Thomas, where you originally had your training, as the chief editor at this point. And there have been 3 issues that have come out. Have you had a chance to look at those issues yet?
I've had a look at them. I think it'll do well. It's I don't so sure. They're going to get more and more papers from the European chapter and society to publish. And they're only bringing it out every 2 months, once every 6 editions a year. I think it'll do all right, but whether they'll need advertising to make money on it.
Looking back, Professor Robb, on your many years with this organization, are there any particular meetings, either the North American chapter or the World Congresses, that really stand out in your mind as being meetings that were very memorable? And could you share any thoughts that you might have about why you would think that at this point?
Well, the World Conferences, they were they were essentially been held in many parts of the world, often in very pleasant places, and some, like the one you mentioned in Barcelona, where was very good, and there was one in London at one time, just after World War II. That must have been probably about 1948 or 50, one of the first ones. And that I remember that very well, largely because it was the war just ended, and it was the first sort of get-together of any size which occurred then. In the North American chapter, I think has always had very good meetings. I think they've been well organized. They now occur, as we have already said, only in large centers. I mean, only because of the numbers, but there have been outstanding meetings. For example, a year ago, there was the one in Boston, I think, was very good meeting. And I remember the one in Los Angeles when you were the president. That was a good one. And we've really met in some excellent places. I think the subjects discussed have, you obviously get occasional years when there's a better, more, the papers strike you as being more original, and then other years when it's a sort of holding pattern. But we've done well with it. I think myself that vascular surgery in its present form is still strong, and that these 2 societies have done a good job, particularly in the way that one is the sort of elite society or the small group, and the other lets anybody who's reasonably competent get in.
Yes. Thinking along these lines and thinking of what the societies have done, would you agree with what appears to be a consensus that the Journal of Vascular Surgery is the premier vascular journal in the world? Do you think that that standard is being maintained?
Yes, I do. I think our present editorial group, Stanley and Ernst, they've done a good job, and it's now been running for 15 years or something, and it's well established, it's excellent, it's maintained a very high quality of paper. I don't think there are any, they're well written, and I think it's got an international reputation, and the number of subscribers who are not members, I think, is probably quite considerable. It's a standard journal in most medical libraries.
About the time that you were president, or at least when you were on the ICVS Executive Council, Dr. Ormond Julian made a recommendation that a new journal be started in the United States. Do you recall any of those deliberations at all, and do you have any thoughts about why that never happened?
Well, I think I do. I think I personally supported it. There was a move to do this. Ormond himself, though, was not. He was putting it forward, but I have a feeling that he wasn't as healthy. He did eventually retire because he got myocardial ischemia, and I think if that had been put forward by somebody who'd been healthy at that time, it would have flown.
Well, of course, when Dr. DeBakey made the pronouncement that he was going to have a new journal, and if we wanted to join him, we were welcome, but if not, he was going to do it anyway.
Right.
That sort of called to the hand, if you will, and that's what really started this, I guess, with a Journal of Vascular Surgery.
And of course, the idea of it being sponsored by the two societies has been good, because both of them profit immensely financially from this journal, and it's jointly owned. And I think that probably some of these why it took a long time to get started was the fact that there were two societies. And then not until the Joint Council became a really efficient body was it possible to do this.
Well, as you probably recall, Dr. John Ochsner stressed to us that the Society for Thoracic Surgery was making about $25,000 a year by owning their own journal and having a contract with Mosby. And we all thought that would be great, and that $25,000 has increased to $500,000 a year now. So it certainly has changed things greatly for all of us.
There's a great deal of money in a journal like that.
One tradition that's developed through the Joint Council and with the two societies has been what now is called the President's Dinner, that includes the past presidents. Yeah. Would you care to talk about that at all? You think it was a good idea?
Well, I think that's an excellent idea. You meet people who, once a year, who have been presidents of these two societies. You meet the current officers, and it's been held now, I forget how many years, but certainly 10 or 12. And I've been to at least 60% or 80% of the ones I've been eligible for. And I think it's been a very good group. We've been well done. It's held just before the meeting. It makes a great, wives come too, so it's a good social event. And the recent one we had at the Cosmos Club, it was a good dinner.
Well, and I think, too, this is another example of the two societies working closely together and having agreements about who should come to the dinner, because there were a few years when we had so many people that it took away from what the intent was, and now it's down to a more limited number. Each president now has the opportunity to invite a few people, but most of the presidents recently have kept it to a relatively small group, and I think it's been a good exchange, too. One of the reasons for bringing this up, and I do want to come back to this in a few minutes as we end this tape when we talk about the archives, because it does mean that past presidents do get together before the meeting, and I have some additional thoughts about that. But thinking again about the overall organization and the vast experience that you've had looking at it over this time, and the fact that you were chairman at Rochester for 18 years after having had 10 years at St. Mary's, you've seen this group on both the European side and the American side. Do you have any additional thoughts about where this group should go or how we should conduct ourselves in the future?
Well, I think having a joint council is very important, and the journal produces great income, and being run jointly is great strength. I think the future, we've got, like everything else, vascular surgery changes. We've got there's a lot of advances which we're sure we continue to keep. Endovascular surgical techniques. We don't want to lose, some of those have major likelihood of being lost to either cardiology or radiology, particularly the balloon angioplasty techniques, because we don't own the X-ray machine. But I don't think we should lose the endovascular prostheses. I think that is something we should do. And there are and then the uses of different techniques, like for various forms of endoscopy and the use of the video camera. That's going to extend more and more into vascular surgery than it has. And one of the striking things is that certain procedures, like, for example, a thoracic sympathectomy, have been done for a very long time without a video camera. And with a video camera, they're so easy to do that quite clearly they're going to be the technique. Yeah. The only way to do an upper dorsal sympathectomy is going to be using a video camera.
Well, we appreciate those thoughts very much. Thinking back one more time about the fact that our organization was originally called the International Society of Angiology, yeah. And as you say, in developing the International Cardiovascular Society, it became more surgical. We both know also that there's an International Union of Angiology. Now, did that develop at essentially the same time that the International Cardiovascular Society identified?
I think it did. And I think that it really was a different kind of people who were in that. There were a lot of people in that who were internists. And there was some very, very fine internists. In Europe, there was a specialty which was not widely practiced in North America. There were quite a lot of European internists who ran clinics looking after people with intermittent claudication, ischemia of the limbs, without being surgeons. And there were many techniques they practiced, and a lot of them were connected with these spa places where you went for health cure, and they would do various procedures which today seem a little ridiculous. For example, in some spas, they would inject the natural gas that bubbled up out of the ground into the arteries, and that was supposed to produce some magical effects. Well, actually it did do some good. And it was a man in Northern Ireland who did a study which compared oxygen, nitrogen, and these natural gases. And he showed that nitrogen was just as good. And he therefore proved that it wasn't a particular gas, such as oxygen, but it was the microembolization that occluded the vessels and then produced a reactive hyperemia, which caused the foot to have a warm, nice feeling.
Well, we know that the International Union of Angiology continues to have meetings, and a number of our friends like Professor Takis Ballas from Athens and Professor Peter Maurer from Munich have been leaders of that organization. What other group do you recall back again in the early deliberations about the venous side of all of this? And I say that and ask that because the International Union of Phlebology has been around for a while, and it's been well organized. Were there any discussions about trying to involve phlebologists with the vascular?
Well, I think we did have a number of people in the early days in the Society of Vascular Surgery who really looked after varicose veins and venous ulcers and that sort of thing. And there were a lot of people. And then what happened, I think, was that the arterial surgery became the dominant side in the 1960s and continued for a long time. But to a number of people who did varicose veins, or I, for example, myself, always looked after venous diseases, never stopped. And some people, like Dr. Villavicencio, did both in a major way. But you had a group in phlebology, which were really dermatologists.
Yes.
They were not surgeons. They looked after ulcers of the legs. They would do sclerotherapy, and they were the ones that, in my view, just went off into the phlebology society, and the surgeons who looked after veins went the route of being part of the vascular societies.
If you could think back in your entire experience in the organization, and you were going to go to a meeting tonight, and you were going to have dinner, and you could have dinner with anybody that you'd ever had dinner with over the years, or anybody you'd ever known, is there anyone that stands out that you would seek out to sit down and have dinner with tonight, do you think?
Well, I've already indicated that Arthur Voorhees and Tom Fogarty was a new idea man, and there must be today one's got to go with the new ideas. So I think I'd try and sit next to the man who's introducing endovascular prostheses to the aortic bifurcation.
Still interested in learning. Well, that's very good. What about the fact that you enjoy a good story? Is there anyone who could tell a story half as well as you could? Was there a storyteller in the group that you might have?
I'm trying to think if there's anybody. No name suddenly springs to mind.
Well, let me mention one. Would Gaza Tackett and his limericks.
Well, Gaza, of course, was a very nice gentleman. He served in the Hungarian army in World War I. He'd served in the Austro-Hungarian army in World War I. He'd served in the mountains of northern Italy, and he came over here after that, and we all knew him very well. And he was one of the early men, particularly in the days of sympathectomy, and when vascular surgery was sympathectomy and varicose veins, more than anything else.
Dr. Alton Ochsner was someone who could tell a good Cajun story. Did you hear a few of those over the years?
Alton I always liked him very much. He was a very nice gentleman. I was visiting Professor once when he was still alive down in Tulane. Oscar Creech was currently the chairman. And I had dinner with Alton Ochsner at his club. And he made a very big impact down there, because he not only founded the Ochsner Clinic, but it wasn't until very recently that I realized that he not only did surgery, but he really did all sorts of medicine. And the other day, I was with my wife at a thing called the Washington Club, and Gage Ochsner was giving a speech to the ladies on the MedStar activities and what it's like to get shot in Washington. And there was a very nice senior lady there who walked up to Gage and showed him a document. And the document was her birth certificate, and she had been delivered by Alton Ochsner, Gage's grandfather, 70 years before or something, in New Orleans. So not only did he do vascular surgery, but he did obstetrics too.
Well, that's very good. A lot of good exchanges over the years, and we appreciate your sharing those few additional thoughts too. Again, thinking about your time at St. Mary's and then subsequently at Rochester, there were many of your staff who became members of the International Society for Cardiovascular Surgery, and certainly Dr. Jim DeWeese became a president of the North American chapter. Are there others on your staff who were active members that you can recall?
Well, Jim DeWeese, of course, also is very active in the international, in the parent organization, because he's Secretary General of that. And Jim was very active in that. In England, Eastcott was active. We had a man called Kenyon who was active, and there was a man called Owen who did a lot of vascular surgery active, but he eventually went off and became a urologist. So but he probably went into that via the renal artery. I think he's got a big practice of doing that. We had some fine other people. There was Alan Downs, who was now in Winnipeg. He was with us. There was, and then we had quite a few European surgeons worked with us. There was Carl Victor Hall, who was the first one to do a in situ vein in the modern world, or we think he was.
Yes.
And there was a Jörg Vollmar, who went on to become chairman of surgery at Ulm in Germany, with two others who
Yes.
worked with us.
Well, certainly many people, and
Yeah.
as we know, a number of people you trained too have continued to contribute. So we appreciate that little bit of reflection back. As we get close to the end of the hour, one of the questions that's come up, and the reason that we're doing all of this, is related to the archives. When you were president, or even before that or subsequently, did you hear anybody talk about the necessity of trying to preserve something? Anybody interested in archives at all?
No, I don't think they were. I think you were one of the main sponsors of this, and I think it's a very good thing. I think it's a pity we didn't have more. I don't know how good the minutes are of the meetings held, for example, at Carmel. They could have been very good, because it was quite a long meeting. I remember it going on well into the night, and we had a good meeting, and the discussions were good, but I don't really recall the minutes very much.
Well, when you mentioned going into the night, that was my introduction too, and fortunately we changed the business meetings to daytime meetings soon after that, because those all-night sessions were tough, and then to get up and have a scientific meeting the next day was virtually impossible. Dr. Shoemaker was the one who encouraged me by example, you might say, and as we both know, he wrote the history of the first 25 years of the Society for Vascular Surgery some 15 years ago or more now. And one of the things he stressed to me at that time is it's so difficult to go back and try to locate photographs, try to find documents, because they rapidly disappear. And it's so obvious that it doesn't take more than a year to lose so much. Now, we both recognize that Dr. Jaime Avicii, and you had alluded to him, had done so much in the beginning, and he did write a history of the origin of our organization, and that was published in the Green Journal. He will also give a reflection 40 years after the beginning this September in Lisbon, so that'll be a very valuable document. One of the tragedies for our effort to get the oral history on an audio videotape is that we've already lost many of our past presidents and good friends who can't do this anymore. So we're very grateful to you and Dr. Shoemaker and others that we will try to get this much of a documentation down for the future. Photographs are also important, and as we know through Bill Maloney's efforts in our executive office, we have taken some photographs, but as I found out too from my own time in 1990, somebody borrowed all the photographs and they loaned them the negatives from the Los Angeles meeting. They never returned them, and nobody knows to whom they were loaned. So now we're going back trying to figure all that out. So there are many, many different problems associated with this, but the one question I have for you, and what I would appreciate your advice on, we have recognized with the presidential dinner that the past presidents do arrive at the annual meeting, and they are there on Saturday. And what I thought I would like to suggest to the current Executive Council, since I have just completed my time, is that they allow us to have maybe a 2-hour session in the afternoon. At the same time that the Joint Council is meeting, we would have a meeting of the past presidents of the North American chapter of the International Society for Cardiovascular Surgery to talk about the archives, to talk about what could be done to improve the effort. And we are looking forward to the 50th anniversary less than 9 years from now, and to get some suggestions about what we should recommend to the Executive Council for inclusion in that celebration at the 50th year. And also to say to the Joint Council that we have the past presidents, and much like the American College of Surgeons and other organizations who've found benefit from the advice of experienced people, we could say if they have any task that they would like to have us review just for an opinion, we would be glad to do that. Do you think something like that
I think that would be
might have some merit?
It would have a good idea. About a 2-hour meeting would be enough, and we could move straight on just before the dinner. We could move straight on almost.
If we tried to do it at lunch, and that would be nice, it's maybe a little bit too early because people might come in the morning wherever we are, and that may compromise people. What I was thinking about is that we might have high tea. And
well, as an Englishman, that's suitable.
But you see, when I asked that, you've already explained high tea to me in the past.
We could have tea.
We could have tea. Now, the question was, if we could have tea, do we have scones or crumpets or biscuits, or what do we have with
I
it?
think it depends what part of Britain you come from. I'd say scones and some cakes.
Well, the thing that I need to finalize on this, too, is it improper if we suggested meeting from 3 to 5 with tea at 4? Would that
be just right?
Be just
very
right?
Nice, yes.
Well,
and I think it'd be a good idea, and we could come up with hopefully something for the 50th years, but also ideas for what the archivist should look into.
Yes. Well, there's no official organization for any of this, except that the council did approve the position of an archivist. And last year, as the archivist, I asked for permission to include you and Henry Jaimievici and Harry Shoemaker on my little ad hoc committee, and they did approve that. I think that having an ad hoc committee continue is more than adequate, and whatever past presidents would like to be involved, we would like to involve. We also have the benefit of the Society for Vascular Surgery having their 50th anniversary in just a couple of years, and we can watch and see what they do and take the best of that and add a little bit and keep somewhat the unique aspects of the International Society for Cardiovascular Surgery going. But I think it would also help justify for the membership the fact that we do have a President's Dinner on Saturday evening, because we can also point out that everybody who comes does a little work for the organization too. And in these days and ages where we have to defend everything and we have to justify every expenditure, this might be a way to make that just a little bit more solid. There's a little method to my, little madness to my method, I guess I should say, too, because we do need some photographs, and this will be one way to ensure that we can have some photographs. I greatly appreciate your sharing your thoughts for this important historical documentation. We probably have a minute or two left. Is there a final thought that you might have, or anything that you would like to include in this historical document? Please, Charles.
Well, not really. I'm trying to think of anything we've missed out. The Society of Vascular, the International Cardiovascular Society, I think in the years when I was president, particularly the 1960s, was an interesting time, because it was the change from a small group which almost met round one table. In fact, it did meet round to a big group. And at that time, it was expanding rapidly, the whole of vascular surgery. I mean, hospitals which never did it were beginning to do it, and we were moving from just a few people doing it to every large medical center doing it. And it's interesting to think back historically to see how how some hospitals shot ahead on this and others didn't. You know, you got people would hold back, but basically today there must be no one that doesn't have a major vascular surgery service.
Well, and you certainly have seen it all. What I would like to do in closing this is to thank you for your pioneering efforts, your many years of leadership by example, and your very valued friendship. Thank you, Charles, very much.
Well, thank you very much, Norman. I think we've done well.
Thank you.